this next story here. Khanna versus Briahna Joy Gray. So Khanna is also on his media tour. So he was on Breaking Points and he was also recently on The Hills Rising. And the discussion a little bit, I think it got a little bit heated, but I think what was interesting about this discussion in reference to how Joe Biden has done as president of the United States, his job performance, I think it was interesting to me the way that Khanna kind of dodged some of these questions, or like the way he tried to avoid answering the questions. And Bree really pushed back on him and continued to ask him like, no, but I'm seriously, can you answer the question? Because he's trying to protect Joe Biden. Look, Khanna know Joe got to go. Khanna know Joe got to go. He knows it. But at the same time, he knows he's gotten the word from DNC leadership that he has to go out there and protect Joe Biden at all costs. I think this conversation is very revealing. And I also have some data receipts that I want to show you that debunks what Khanna is saying. And these receipts are recent in reference to the economy. So let's go ahead and get into this particular discussion here with Briahna Joy Gray and Khanna man.
The issue as well, I think people have been pointing to the consequences of the pandemic era programs ending. The administration once bragged about having child poverty. Now we're seeing kind of record levels of the same. There has been a lot of disappointment around the student debt issue, as I'm sure you know. Many of us got emails in our inbox over the last week or so announcing that we were going to have to start repayments as of next month in the middle of an election year after 3 years of having the loans on a moratorium that was put there by Donald Trump while Donald Trump was in office. Do you think that Democrats can make a good case that the economy is doing well and that they should feel better about their economic status today than they did 3 or 4 years ago?
The question, because he's going to go all around corners with this. Do you think the Democrats can make a good case that the economy is doing well today? Let's just all hold on to that, because Ro likes to talk a lot. So here we go.
But Briahna, I do. I mean, we got the infrastructure bill passed. If you go around the country, there are a lot of good paying jobs. We're bringing manufacturing back, semiconductor manufacturing, new electric.
Let's go back to this part. Watch this. They kill me with this.
Better about their economic status today than they did 3 or 4 years ago.
But Briahna, I do. I mean, we got the infrastructure bill passed. If you go around the country, there are a lot of good paying jobs.
That part right there. Good paying jobs. Define good paying. Because they all say this. We have good paying jobs. What's good? Depending on where you live, $15 an hour might be good. Depending on where you live, $15 an hour, maybe nothing for you. So what do they mean when they say good paying? I would ask for a definition of that. What is the hourly wage that Khanna considers to be a good paying job? And I think we need to start asking this question, guys. It's just like, well, what does that mean? Let's continue.
Bringing manufacturing back, semiconductor manufacturing, new electric vehicle battery manufacturing. We're creating a lot of union jobs. Unions have never been stronger. The president's NLRB has said that if you have unfair labor practices, this is Jennifer Abruzzo in the CMEX decision, then you
guys see these same talking points? Watch this. I told you.
But Briahna, I do. I mean, we got the infrastructure bill passed. If you go around the country, there are a lot of good paying jobs. We're bringing manufacturing back, semiconductor manufacturing, new electric vehicle battery manufacturing. We're creating a lot of union jobs. Unions have never been stronger. The president's NLRB has said that if you have unfair labor practices, this is Jennifer Abruzzo in the CMEX decision, then unions will automatically be recognized. So a lot of
the NLRB. You know, that's been getting a lot of attention lately. You guys noticed that some of the people in independent media have the same talking point as the politicians and the Democratic Party? Anybody notice this? Some of the people who said that they're progressives and they believe in these progressive issues, they're all saying the same. This is the same thing. Crystal and Kyle said the same thing. The NLRB. Sam Cedar, we got the NLRB. Cenk Uygur, the NLRB. They're using the same talking points the Democratic Party is using. And I'm going to tell you guys this going into 2024. I believe the reason that a lot of these people have gotten on board with this NLRB talk and the union talk, and I'm for unions. But the reason why they're on board with it is because that is what they are going to use to convince you to vote for the Democratic Party in 2024. Because they know Joe Biden hasn't really done anything. That's why they're using this. And Ro Khanna is doing the same thing. They're following the verbiage of the politicians, you guys. When you are actually supposed to be above the politicians when it comes to the narrative and the message, you're not supposed to follow their narrative. You're supposed to have your own narrative. So here we go. Now you know why they all keep saying the same thing. The NLRB. And I told you, the NLRB does not help people who are disabled and cannot work. It does not help people who are homeless. It doesn't help those people in Oklahoma that just got evicted because the landlords had decided to get rid of Section 8. It doesn't help those things. But that is the Democratic Party talking point going into 2024. And for those that are part of progressive media that are telling you this right now, they're going to be leading with that going into 2024. This praise of the unions is not because they really, really believe, yes, we need strong unions. We weren't hearing about all this before. They just keep talking about it over and over and over, back to back, because that is what they are going to use as the excuse for you to vote for the Democratic Party. Watch.
Good has happened. But look, I disagree on the student loans. I mean, it was the Supreme Court that struck that down. And I believe I've pushed the president to say, at least let's stop the interest accrual. As someone who took out $100,000 of loans, I was fortunate. I paid them back. But there were years in my 20s when I was making payments and the number kept piling up because of interest. And so we have to at least stop that interest accrual. And I do hear people struggling because of the student loan issue.
Well, Representative Khanna, I do have to push back on two things. One, the loans have started again because Joe Biden chose to negotiate the end of the moratorium as part of the last debt ceiling negotiations. That was a choice by Joe Biden that cannot be attributed to the Supreme Court. If he plans to challenge the Supreme Court decision, as he is doing, he could say, let's continue the moratorium so that people don't have to pay sums that ultimately are going to be canceled when I am successful. And two, many student loan experts, all of the student loan experts that I've spoken to, and I think I've talked to you about this on my own podcast as well, so that Joe Biden could have made the choice to cancel all student debt via executive order using the same authority that Trump used to start the moratorium in the first place. But because he chose to means test it, he gave people this hook to go ahead and challenge it in court. So for many voters, they understand that this was a choice, a series of choices that the Biden administration made that have put them in the situation of starting repayment next month. So what do you say to those 44 million voters who might be feeling betrayed by Joe Biden in this instance?
So what Bree is pointing out is the fact that obviously Joe Biden did not follow instructions when it came to canceling student loan debt. He could have done it by executive order. He could have canceled all of it, right? Then there was this issue where Ayanna Pressley, Elizabeth Warren, and Chuck Schumer actually gave instructions to Joe Biden to cancel student loan debt via the Higher Education Act of 1965. And Joe Biden chose to do this through the HEROES Act, which was beyond cray, considering that the pandemic emergency, he had already ended that. So obviously that was going to get struck down. It did get struck down by a federal judge and it ended up in the Supreme Court. And we ended up in this hellish of a situation. Whether or not you believe that student loan debt should be canceled or not, the way that Joe Biden went about doing this was just ridiculous. He could have just easily done this a lot better. But again, I don't think the real intention was for him to cancel all of it in the first place. I think that Joe Biden did just enough to try to convince people, hey, I'm trying to do something here, and not realizing that more people were paying attention to some of those organizations that were pressuring Joe Biden to cancel student loan debt more so than they were electoral politics. So I think this is something that we have to hold on to, because I want you to hear Ro Khanna's response, because he's trying to blame it on the Supreme Court. But the point that Bree is making, if he would have done it the correct way in the first place, it would have never made it to the Supreme Court and we would have been in a different situation.
Well, look, the president used the HEROES Act, and he can still use the Higher Education Act. So even though he made that deal with McCarthy, which I disagreed with, I voted against it, as you remember, he still now is pursuing the Higher Education Act to trying to suspend the repayments on the loans. And I believe under the Higher Education Act, he will have the authority. And I do think the administration should, when they have the authority, zero out the loans up to the $20,000 that they've said, so that people, if they're going to court, are going into court to sue students as opposed to having no relief. Would I have been more aggressive than the president? I would have. But the reality is that the president has done a lot. I mean, he has.
Pause here for a second. So the repayments start in October. So we don't have that much longer, 2 weeks and like maybe 2 days or something, 2 weeks in a day. In October, they go back into repayment. So Khanna is saying that he can actually do this through he can do the fix in reference to the repayments with the Higher Education Act. He can still do that. The question is, why hasn't it been done? Why are we always racing up against like this clock every time? And then two, it causes a lot of stress for the people. And two, the other problem that I have in reference to this whole deal with the student loan debt, student loan repayments was paused under the Trump administration. Some people may not remember this. I do, though. Those of us that have student loans, I remember when they were paused, okay? They were paused under the Trump administration. The student loan repayments are going to be starting again under the Biden administration. When we look at the stimulus checks, we received more money under the Trump administration than we did under the Biden administration, and Biden shortchanged us on a check. These are things that people are going to remember. Let's continue.
Invoke the authority. He's fought this in court. He's now invoking another authority. And the real blame of this is on the Supreme Court and on the Republican side, where they made zero effort. So I and some progressives want to make an effort of a 10. President Biden probably was at a 7. And then you've got a Supreme Court and Republicans at a 0. The blame doesn't go from someone who's at a 7. The blame goes to people who are at a 0.
The blame goes to people on all sides, Ro. The blame goes to people at all sides because he didn't do this correctly in the first place to begin with. So yes, you can still blame Joe Biden. You can blame the Supreme Court. But if Joe Biden would have done this the correct way in the first place, we wouldn't have had to deal with the Supreme Court ruling. And Khanna knows that, but he's trying to avoid dealing with that part of the discussion.
Khanna, isn't it the case that but for him choosing to negotiate of all things the end of the moratorium, people would not have to start paying in the middle of an election year their student loan payments back on October 1st? That was a choice that was purely within Joe Biden's purview, no?
No, because he negotiated saying that he wouldn't invoke the HEROES Act. He's now invoking a different authority. He's invoking the Higher Education Act. And if the Supreme Court was going to strike down
that's a different
the use
question,
of the HEROES Act, then
oh, man, he's talking about something completely different. She's talking about the repayment. And when it comes to the repayment, yes, that's happening under Joe Biden. That's the point that she's trying to make. Hold on.
For him choosing to negotiate of all things the end of the moratorium, people would not have to start paying in the middle of an election year their student loan payments back on October 1st. That was a choice that was purely within Joe Biden's purview, no?
No, because he negotiated saying that he wouldn't invoke the HEROES Act. He's now invoking a different authority. He's invoking the Higher Education Act. And if the Supreme Court was going to strike down
a different
the use
question,
of the HEROES Act, then the negotiation wouldn't have mattered. It was moot after the Supreme Court. He would have had to have a different negotiation. The negotiation only covers the HEROES Act. It doesn't cover the
I'm specifically talking about the end of the moratorium, not the question about whether or not the cancellation itself will ultimately be held up by the courts is a separate issue, but we can move on. But I want to be really clear. The moratorium is what people are concerned with, that Joe Biden made the choice to make them start repaying in the middle of an election year.
And people will remember that. People will remember that. And let me tell you something, you guys. You know how we know that our government is full of it in reference to repayments? They have had a pause on student loan repayments. Again, this goes back to the Trump administration. It started under Trump. So it's been what? A couple years, right? So if those student loan companies can go this long without payments, that go to show you he could have just canceled it. Because let me tell you what's going to happen when these loans go into repayment in October, particularly since I'm going to show you the inflation rate in a second, because I'm going to tell you he's not honest about the economy. Some of these people are not going to be able to pay these loans. And if that happens, we could see ourselves dealing with another similar housing crisis, but this time a housing crisis that is escalated by student loan debt. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but let him continue. This is something to think about.
But the moratorium is also under the HEROES Act. You could have the moratorium under the Higher Education Act. And we should
but the
be pushing
moratorium
for
wasn't.
more.
But the moratorium wasn't what was challenged. That's a Trump era policy that has been persisted for 3 years.
True, but the moratorium, the deal with McCarthy only applies to the HEROES Act. You can still have a moratorium under the Higher Education Act or other authorities, and we should be pushing for a moratorium on interest accrual and student repayment. And I believe we can do that even under the terms of the deal, because that only restricts the HEROES Act.
Right.
It's always funny when he says we should be pushing. He's the one that's in Congress, so he should be pushing for these things. But the point is we're coming up against the clock, and it's 2 weeks away from October, and that's when the repayments do start. And when I show you what's true about the economy, what they're not telling, what Ro Khanna is not being honest about, you'll understand why I feel the way that I do when it comes to the repayment. Let's continue.
Now, obviously, there are many of us who think that people should repay exactly what they borrowed, and that it would be a blunder to forgive people's debt obligations. Actually, but that's my perspective. Obviously, not the progressive perspective. Representing
Robbie, that ain't got nothing to do. That has nothing to do with it, because the thing is, I knew he would slide that in there, because the thing is this, whether you agree with canceling student loan debt or not, that's not the issue. The issue is the fact that Joe Biden made promises. He ran on promises to the people, and he hasn't fulfilled his promises. That's the problem. I knew he was going to slide that in there.
We wanted to ask you about a couple other things. You put forth a new 5-point political reform platform, which includes things like banning candidates for federal office from receiving donations from lobbyists or political action committees of any kind, 18-year term limits for Supreme Court justices. If Democrats win the House, will this legislation be a priority? Can you talk about it a little bit more?
Pause here so you guys can see it for a second. 5-point comprehensive political reform, banning candidates for federal office from receiving donations from lobbyists or political action committees of any kind. Let me ask y'all a question. Why didn't Ro Khanna just say ban corporate money from electoral politics? Not willing to go that far. You see, like if you're going to go there, go all the way there. Ban corporate money from electoral politics. The other thing, banning members of Congress from trading stocks and becoming lobbyists after they serve. Says one of the biggest stock trading mofos in Congress. I've shown you guys before on this show about Ro Khanna's stocks, spending and trading and closing deals and all different types of stocks. Ro Khanna's response on Twitter is, those are not my stocks. Those are my wife's stocks. They're all in your name, all in his name. Let's go on to the other ones here. 18-year term limits for Supreme Court justices, 12-year term limits for members of Congress. Ooh, that one would be, ooh, man, Nancy would not be there. Sorry. A judicial code of ethics for all federal judges and Supreme Court justices. Let's go on.
Nancy Pelosi, Hakeem Jeffries, how do they feel about your legislation? Fill us in.
Well, I'll be putting it up hopefully for a vote, and I want the Democrats to run on this. The president and members of Congress, we should have zero PAC money. We should not have leadership PACs. I don't take PAC money, never have, don't have a leadership PAC. We shouldn't have money from corporations or lobbyists. Members of Congress shouldn't be allowed to go become lobbyists ever. Members of Congress shouldn't benefit personally through stock trading. Members of Congress should be term limited, as should Supreme Court justices, and we need an ethics code for Supreme Court justices. The amazing thing is this common sense proposal has had so much support from across the aisle, and I think it is a opportunity for us to run on reform, to make reform. No one in the current political system is perfect. What voters are looking for is a bold agenda to fix the system.
Voters aren't looking for an agenda. Voters are looking for actual solutions. I can have an agenda. How many times have you gone to a meeting? You guys ever gone to meetings and like you get the agenda, like first when you sit down, here's the agenda. And you may not make it through all the items on the agenda, or you do make it through all the items on the agenda during the meeting, but then there are follow-ups that need to happen with those agenda items and people don't follow up. My life story in higher ed, okay? My life story in higher ed. And so-and-so is going to do this item and so-and-so is going to do that action item. And we all leave the meeting like, yeah, great, sure. Next meeting, never followed up. Anyway, you can't just have an agenda. You have to actually fix the problems. You can write anything down. You can have a 5-point plan, a 10-point plan. You can have as many plans as you want. Joe Biden also had plans written down. But if you're not actually going to implement those things, then what's the point? That's how I see it.
Do you think Biden should embrace this agenda?
I do. You know, I don't understand how a twice impeached, 4 times indicted former president is trying to run as the outsider. And I believe that the Democratic Party needs to run as the outsider. They're going to clean up a system that obviously isn't working for the ordinary Americans. Do I think most people who come to Congress have good intentions? I do. I actually do. But the point is that the system itself is totally influenced by lobbyists, by special interest money, by members then ending up and going and becoming lobbyists. And the American people have no faith in that the system is actually looking out for them.
If Ro Khanna is sitting here and he's willing to admit that the system is a problem, which I agree, the system is a problem, the corporate money, the lobbyists, why is Ro Khanna still willing to support that system? When you endorse Joe Biden, when you endorse corporate candidates, you are still supporting that system. If Ro Khanna was serious about what he was saying, he would be supporting someone who is running against the system. He would be supporting someone like a Dr. West who's not taking this corporate money, but he's not going to do that. You know why? Because Ro Khanna is full of shit. Ro Khanna is just saying enough so that he can still have some type of progressive street cred without actually really doing these things. That's typically how it works. AOC has championed this. Ilhan Omar is actually, she a little bit more tougher than the other ones. Rashida Tlaib is championed this, except for Israel Palestine. She's right on that issue. But you guys, you see where I'm coming from. That's what he's doing. So I'd call him out on that.
These are the types of reforms that will say we're trying to prioritize people over special interests.
You know, there are challengers to Joe Biden, Marianne Williamson, RFK Jr., who are running on I think objectively more progressive platforms, or probably even are more on board with some of the policies you yourself have put forward, including what you've just outlined. And obviously there are so many in the Democratic Party that have said they would like a different nominee, which I know I've already asked you about. But is it simply because, you know, Biden is the incumbent, so, you know, it would be very odd to not support the incumbent, even though there are more progressives in the race? You know, what is the reason that one feels so strongly about sticking with President Biden?
Well, ideology isn't the only thing you look at when you vote for president of the United States. Experience matters. Can you do the job? Can you be the leader of the free world? Are you going to
pause? Experience matters. Can you do the job? Do you guys believe Joe Biden can do the job right now? Doesn't look like it. Doesn't look like it. Ro Khanna knows that Joe Biden is in decline. We all see it. It's embarrassing. So the thing is this, like, can do the job. I would argue Joe Biden can't do the job. That would be my pushback, because he's trying to say ideology isn't the only thing. Okay.
be able to rally our allies? Do you know how to lead the military? Are you going to be able to build coalitions in the House and the Senate to get things?
Do you think Joe Biden can lead the military right now, guys? Because I don't think Joe Biden can lead the military right now.
Done. Are you going to be able to spearhead legislation? So yes, there's some of his challengers who I may agree with on Medicare for all or free public college. But when I look at who I think would be the best president overall, I believe that's Joe Biden.
Think about what he just said. He agrees with the colleagues that support Medicare for all, those progressive policies. But when he's looking at someone who will be best for the job, someone who can lead, he agrees with Joe Biden. To that I say, do what job, Khanna? Because if you agree with those progressive policies, part of the job should be him moving towards some of those progressive policies and trying to implement, especially the ones that he can do on by executive order, implement some of those policies. That would be part of the job. You see, this is why people like Khanna, actually, he's really good at this. People like Khanna, AOC stumbles a little bit. Elizabeth Warren, I think they tend to be really good at saying things that are like this general verbiage, but not really focusing on the specifics. And so they say things that sounds good in passing, but when you think about what their core beliefs are supposed to be, it doesn't match up. So for example, like I said, when he says can do the job, is going to do the job and lead the country, part of the job, if you believe in those progressive principles, would be for Joe Biden to move towards those types of policies, which he is not doing. And I get tired of people saying the Democratic Party has moved far left. The Democratic Party has moved further to the right. Joe Biden doesn't even want, what happened to the public option for health insurance? What happened to that? No public option. See how that just goes out the window?
You believe you listed a number of things. It seems like Medicare for all, having universal health care for millions of Americans, and the richest country in the history of the world, where we're currently paying twice as much for health care costs than any other peer nation. And we have something called medical bankruptcy, and also 68,000 people before the pandemic dying every year from a lack of health care, is lower on the priority list than someone who can lead a military which many Americans on both sides of the aisle feel like should be led less, a military budget that we think should be cut. Many Americans think that should be cut significantly. Is it accurate to say that I've articulated your priorities?
Mischaracterization of my position. I was the only person on the Armed Services Committee, 1 out of 56, that people can look at, who voted against the military budget going to $1 trillion. And I've led on Medicare for all with Bernie Sanders. I'm going to be actually coming out with a bill with him on medical debt. But
let me stop here before he continues, because let me show you what he's trying to do. So he tends to do this a lot, where he talks about the way that he's voted, but he leaves out legislation where he's voted in the opposite way. So he voted against increasing the defense budget, but he voted for sending billions of dollars to Nazis in Ukraine. So it's just, it's things like that. I'm leading the way with Medicare for all, but I'm telling people to vote against the candidates that are running on Medicare for all. It's just stuff like that. That's all.
person on the Armed Services Committee, 1 out of 56 that people can look at, who voted against the military budget going to $1 trillion. And I've led on Medicare for all with Bernie Sanders. I'm going to be actually coming out with a bill with him on medical debt. But it is giving people false hope to say that someone can just run on that and then get things done. What we need is people who are going to run on that and actually get co-sponsors, push for a hearing, as Pramila Jayapal and I have, as Bernie Sanders would have. The reason I supported Bernie Sanders is that he was in the House and he was in the Senate. It wasn't just that he was taking these positions. He knew, I had full confidence that Bernie Sanders had become president that he would have been able to actually get these things done. And I don't believe you can just run for president without having any prior experience in the federal system and be effective.
Some people would disagree with you with that, Rokana, because the thing is, if we look at Donald Trump's presidency, although I don't agree with a lot of the things that Donald Trump did, some of his base would tell you that Donald Trump was effective in getting things done. I may not have agreed with what he got done, but that was someone who did not have experience in politics. He was not in the House. He was not in the Senate. And he still got things done, whether we agreed with what he got done or not. So for Rokana to say that in order to get those things done, you need to have that type of experience, we've already seen that's not necessarily the case. So I disagree with that statement that he made there. Let me go back just a little bit. Sorry.
Bernie Sanders had become president, that he would have been able to actually get these things done. And I don't believe you can just run for president without having any prior experience in the federal system and be effective. I don't. Bernie Sanders had a lot of that experience.
And what do you say to those who say, okay, well, I voted for Biden in 2020 because that was the pitch that was made. And in fact, what we've been hearing for the last 3 years is that to the extent that his agenda, core items of his agenda, promises that he made to Bernie Sanders of things he would fight for when Bernie Sanders dropped out very quickly in 2020 have not been actualized. For example, a $15 minimum wage, a policy so popular that Trump's Florida in 2020 voted for it with 60% of voters supporting that particular policy. The Build Back Better being bifurcated and largely stripped in its final incarnation. The Willow Project, the student debt issue, which we've already discussed, which you attribute its failure to the Supreme Court. If the argument is that Joe Biden wasn't able to effectuate any of those kinds of policies, big ticket items, big promises, canceling all HBCU debt, canceling $10,000 to $20,000 of student debt for all Americans, a $15 minimum wage. Can you really argue that Joe Biden is able to get things done?
Oof.
Well, look, I said that we should have fired the Senate parliamentarian. I wish we had gotten the $15 wage, and I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post calling for that. I think the Willow Project was a terrible decision. $8 billion on public lands in Alaska for the largest oil drilling project on public lands.
But Joe Biden's doing a great job, though, Rokana. Isn't that what you said before? Let me tell you a little story about the Senate parliamentarian for those who may not be aware. You can fire the Senate parliamentarian. The last president I remember doing that was George W. Bush. He had some disagreements in the way that the Senate parliamentarian was voting on particular issues or making these decisions. And George W. Bush said, gotta go. Joe Biden can do the same thing. And this is what I said a year ago, that if he was really that frustrated with the way that the Senate parliamentarian has been acting when it comes to legislation, and they are kind of the deciding vote, Joe Biden could simply just fire the Senate parliamentarian. The reality is the Senate parliamentarian is doing exactly what Joe Biden wants them to do. Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema were doing exactly what Joe Biden wanted them to do. Remember, Joe Biden is not to the left, so to speak. If these people were so problematic, they would have been removed from some of these committees that they still sitting on. I didn't see Joe Manchin removed from any of these committees when he voted against these pieces of legislation that would have helped the American people during the time of the pandemic when people really needed that help. I didn't see Kyrsten Sinema removed from any of those committees when she voted against those key legislations. And the Senate parliamentarian is still sitting there in place, which is someone that he immediately could have fired. So again, I feel like this is all a game. I feel like these people, they do these things in a way to make it seem like they're really trying to fight. Some of them may really want to fight, but the reality is, when you can move these different chess pieces across the board and you are choosing only to move one piece instead of moving several pieces at the same time, it is because you choose to do so. So Joe Biden chose to do that. He chose to be least effective. And that is because, again, he is also answering to his donors and to the military industrial complex. And that's what this all leads back to. You have to follow the money. Ro Khanna knows that. That's why the Senate parliamentarian hasn't been fired. These people are doing exactly what they were put there to do. I don't believe any of this is a coincidence or an accident. They're doing what they were put there to do, and that's why they're still there.
It was a gut punch to climate activists. So, I am not saying that Joe Biden has been the perfect progressive president. I don't think he's been what Bernie Sanders would have been. But you have to look at the whole record, and he has gotten manufacturing jobs back. He has been one of the most pro-labor, pro-union presidents. He has stood up for reproductive rights. He has.
So they always want to bring up the labor thing. Every time they bring up the labor thing, guys, particularly to you, you always bring up that railroad strike. Because it's funny when people say Joe Biden's been the most pro-labor president. You crushed the potential of a railroad worker strike. And I believe, and I told you before, they were going to try to intervene when it came to the UPS workers. The UAW has a deadline to go on strike. I believe it is 11:59 p.m. tomorrow night. That if their needs aren't met, they're going to go on strike. I believe that is the deadline. I won't cover that story until whether or not they decide if they're going to go on strike. I don't want to get people's hopes up like I did last time with UPS. So I just want to say something that we have to keep into consideration here. When he was able to do so, to intervene with these strikes, he intervened. That's not pro-labor. And I think some of these people taking union money, because I've been thinking about this. Some of these people sitting back and is like, oh yeah, he's the most pro-labor president. We saw the ad that was from part of the teacher union. And some of you were in the chat and said, that's my union. I don't support this at all. And we're pushing back on it and said the people that were part of the union didn't have a say so. Like, are these people, the Democratic Party paying these people, or these people sending money to the Democratic Party? I'm gonna start thinking about these things, because it seemed like to me there's some backroom deals going on. There's some of these unions, are they giving money to the Democratic Party? Is the Democratic Party infiltrating these unions? I'm looking on Twitter and I'm seeing the president of the UAW, and it shows he's holding meetings with politicians in the Democratic Party. And I'm like, what is happening here? Why are politicians having a seat at the table in reference to union decisions? They don't need to be there. The United Auto Workers, if they want to decide to go on strike, why do they need to have Rashida Tlaib and other politicians show up at these meetings to talk to them? Talk to them about what? It's their job. Those politicians don't work for the UAW. Why are they showing up to these meetings? What are they telling these unions? And next thing you know, the strike is avoided. I'll let him finish.
In the railroad strike, though, Representative Khanna, the concern is that he's a man of contradictions. He says he's the most pro-labor president. He has not made forceful statements supporting the workers in the impending UAW strike, and he crushed the rail strike earlier this year in a moment that people thought was one of the most anti-union actions that they've seen in their lifetimes. And with all due respect, I hear you distinguishing yourself from Biden, and I credit your record. But unless you are going to run for president, which I think some people would really love to see, at the end of the day, the question is whether or not the arguments that are made in Joe Biden's favor about his ability to get things done hold up 3 years after the Democratic Party has largely made the case that Joe Biden is not Joe Biden's fault that he hasn't been able to fulfill many of his campaign promises.
Woof.
Well, I would say that Joe Biden has been more progressive than I expected.
Come on, man. See, you notice how he doesn't answer the question?
He is standing on labor. I think he is genuinely. He stood with Starbucks workers. He stood with Amazon workers. He's standing with UAW workers. Now, I think we need to be 100% with UAW workers. I mean, the big three have had $5 billion in stock buybacks. Where is that money going that they can't pay the workers more and they're getting tax subsidies? So obviously, you're going to hear a progressive like me, like Bernie Sanders, like others in the progressive caucus, we want a bolder, more populist economic message and stand clearer on climate and income inequality issues. That's why I supported Bernie Sanders. But in the context of the choice between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and in the context of his record, I would argue that it represents a shift of the Democratic Party more in the direction of Bernie Sanders than not, and we should build on that progress.
No, Ro, you all over the place. Row your boat, because the thing is this. Let me show you some data, okay? Let me show you a little bit of data. Because when they talk about the economy, they like to talk about the child poverty rate and they like to talk about inflation. So check this out. Did you guys see this? Holy moly. Child poverty rate rose from an all-time low of 5.2% in 2021 to 12.4% in 2022, reflecting end of temporary child allowance and other programs. I'll make this bigger for you. You see this? Look, let's look at the data. Changes in child poverty by race and ethnicity. To be clear, this is the Supplemental Poverty Measure, SMP, which takes into account taxes / government benefits. Look at this, guys. Let me see if is it bigger when okay, good. Child supplemental poverty rates by race and Hispanic origin, 2009 to 2022. Look at this spike. Boom. 19.5%. 2022. You see this? That is for Hispanic. It says Hispanic, any race. 19.5. For African Americans, which is the yellow line, 17.8%. For Asian Americans, 9.9%. And for non-Hispanic white, 7.2%. First of all, regardless of the race, this should not happen in the wealthiest country in the world. But everyone's saying that the economy is great. We cut child poverty in half. See that? This is telling. And another thing I want to point out to you, for Black people, we are like 13, I think it's 13% of the population now. Some people say 12, some people say 13. 13% of the population. We are only 13% of the population, but the child poverty rate is 17.8%. Honey, let me tell you, make this make sense. Make it make sense. This is the thing I want people to see. When people talk about class and we talk about class and race and all this, this is what I was trying to tell you guys. When it comes to the majority, where non-Hispanic white are the majority in reference to demographics in the United States, 7.2% child poverty, still bad. But of course, white people have the least amount. Black people are only 13% of the population higher up when it comes to child poverty. I believe she had one more piece here. Biggest 1 year increase on record. Here we go. Census announces SPM child poverty rate of 12.4% in 2022. Context from 1967 to 2021. The largest year-over-year increase in SPM child poverty rate was 10.7. We now easily have a record increase in child poverty. This is the piece they're not showing people. And people need to see this, because I've been trying to tell people, oh no, we cut child poverty in half. But you see what happened when they cut that short, when they ended the child poverty, they cut it short. It skyrocketed again. But it's never, they said this is the highest increase. So it's record increase. That is scary in the United States of America. At least 10 states this year have started to fill the void left by the end of the federal child allowance by creating or expanding their own state level child tax credit programs. And this is the reason why some of these states started to implement the free lunch programs that we talked about, right? So when they cut that, the child allowance, some of the states came in to pick up the slack. So Massachusetts were one of them, Maine, Idaho, California, Oklahoma. Minnesota means new or improved CTC. So Minnesota, New York, Vermont. You see? But guys, this is great that the states are doing this, but look at the gray states. That's a lot of states in this country where kids are left out. Billions for Ukraine, though. Billions for Ukraine. So these are the kind of things when we start pushing back about why Joe Biden should not be president. These are the kind of things we need to show people, because this is just a hot mess. America chose to more than double the child poverty rate last year. We could choose differently. Whew. So that's one lie they continue to tell. The other one is inflation. Now, I mentioned this earlier today. I think it was today on Rising, one of those shows. I mentioned that this is another thing they're trying to be a little quiet about. And they keep saying inflation is at a record low. Inflation is up, boo. And I told you all you had to do was look at the prices. All you had to do was go to the grocery store and you would see it yourself. I go to the grocery store once a week because I mini shop. But so things don't go bad. But I mini shop. And so I can see the prices increase every week. But I'm going to keep it real. Inflation is back up. Listen to this. Ro Khanna's not going to tell you this when they talk about the economy.
New inflation numbers in the United States show that consumer prices rose 0.6% in August, with rising gas prices accounting for over half of that increase. Now, if you strip away the volatile food and energy prices, that's called core inflation, and that slowed to 4.3% from 4.7%, an indication that the Federal Reserve's 11 rate hikes are working their way through the economy. Rahel Solomon joins us now to break this down. This is the importance of not just looking at an annual number and comparisons that are made over a 12-month period, which actually showed inflation rising, but to look at the month on month, which continues this trend lower despite those rising fuel prices.
Exactly, Julia. This is a report that really indicates that the devil is in the details, as they say. So as you said, headline inflation did tick up a bit, largely in line with expectations, but ticking up to a level and at a rate that we haven't seen since June of 2022. But most of that was energy, as you pointed out. And that, of course, is because of what we're seeing with production cuts with.
Thank you, Jessica. He said midnight tonight is the deadline, the auto worker union leader. Okay, yes, midnight tonight. All right. I'll check for that then.
OPEC. That said, if you look at core inflation, which most economists believe is a better indicator of the path of inflation, you actually see a continued moderation, right? You see prices increase 0.3% on a monthly basis. That was a touch hotter than economists were expecting. But I can tell you that most of that was because of the continued rise in shelter, or as our international audience might think of, accommodation. So that continued to be the largest driver. We also saw airline fares, they ticked up. So that sort of contributed there too.
So people who are poor and working class, like when they mentioned the airline fares, to me, that was just kind of, I mean, if you poor, you ain't got money to take a plane right now. Like you just don't have money to buy a plane ticket. Like these are the kind of things I think people, maybe they do realize it. These are the kind of things I think sometimes need to be said. A lot of times, if you grow up poor or working class, whereas upper middle class people and wealthy people, they buy airline tickets, they take a plane. You get on the bus, you take the Greyhound, or you drive as a family in the car and your mom packs the food for everybody. She makes sandwiches for everybody. So you do that to save money so that you don't pay for the airline tickets. So it was interesting to me that they mentioned airline tickets here along with shelter, food, and car insurance. That did it for me. Okay. That did it for me. But shelter plus 7.3%, food plus 4.3%, and car insurance plus 19.1%.
You take a look over the last year or so, some of the biggest increases, shelter, accommodations, food, car insurance, those continue to rise. Energy prices, however, remember, Julia, a year ago, we were at sort of peak energy prices. And so take a look. Energy prices have fallen year over year. That is certainly good news. Although on a monthly basis, as I said, they're ticking back up. Used car prices have fallen. And on an annual basis, airline fares have also fallen.
Because people can't afford to buy no damn tickets. Look, guys, airline fares down 13.3% because people can't afford to buy plane tickets. Used cars down 6.6%. People can't afford to buy cars. That just, nah. I mean, look at how they phrase it. Yes, energy down. Yes, that's good for the environment. But again, like I told you before, until they end these wars and they stop the CO2 consumption and the methane gas, like this is nothing compared to the war damage to the climate. But it's just interesting to me. She's like, good news. These energy prices are down, but she's not explaining why, because people can't afford to do it. Even when it comes to energy, down 3.6%, that's people not paying their light bill. Let's just keep it real.
The implications of this, Julia, could not be greater. Of course, the Fed meets exactly a week from now. We will hear from the Fed exactly a week from now. The expectation largely is that they will pause, at least for now, because despite what the headline shows, this is a report that suggests that perhaps that 11 rate hikes are starting to work. They are starting to sort of funnel through the system, and that perhaps that it is actually working. And so this appears to be a report that is largely in line with expectations and no major surprises.
Yes, like gas prices or petrol prices, to those that use that terminology, we're a long way from the peaks, and it's the same with inflation. So one can certainly say those rate hikes have.
But these politicians are telling you that the economy is doing great. What? What?